Lovely to see you all here, and thank you. It does look like the atrium is pretty full, so thank you for all being part of the lecture series this term. This is the last one that we have. I went to Professor Priyu's place on the weekend, and we sat around the fire talking and smoking cigars. And he said to me, for the third time, this is the third time Professor Priyu, I don't know if you realize this, but for the third time he said to me, don't you ever get sick of standing up and having to come up with something to say again about the same thing that you're doing over and over again? So given that I've introduced our provost, I think maybe 17 times for one reason or another, I decided today, albeit at the last minute, that I would ask Eitan if he would come and give the introduction for this afternoon's speech. For two reasons. Firstly, I think it's very good for a student to introduce the provost. Secondly, I know that Eitan has taken the study of these texts very seriously. So to introduce our provost today, please welcome your classmate, Eitan Zarin.
Good evening, everybody. I'm glad there's so many people here. A few words about the Oven of Akhnai before introducing the legendary Provost Howland. The rabbis debate whether or not an oven made of fragments is susceptible to ritual impurity. Rabbi Eliezer, the only man who believes the oven is ritually pure, performs a bunch of miracles to support his case, uprooting a carob tree, reversing the flow of a river, collapsing walls, and calling on heaven to support his case. The other rabbis argue that rulings are decided based on a majority vote, not the performance of miracles. The main view in Judaism is simple. God's presence has slowly become less overt. There are three stages to this concealment. 1, the destruction of the first temple. 2, the loss of prophecy. And 3, the destruction of the second temple. Obviously, the revelation at Mount Sinai is the most overt encounter with God. In biblical times, everything God wanted came through the actions of a prophet. Each stage of concealment puts more control into our hands, especially regarding the interpretation of law. It was the job of Talmudic rabbis, and now our job, to decide what are the correct rulings in each case, and we take the oral law and combine it with the written law, and we debate. And based on the system of rules, we follow a certain opinion. In this case, it's the majority opinion. So why does God conceal? There was a time when we had to work on our relationship with God. And that was during the time of the first temple. But God desired relationships between people. So he moved from relationships between God and man to relationships between man and man. And we do that to search for meaning together, which is also what we do at UATX. And now to introduce our very own Provost Howland. Professor Jacob Howland is college provost and dean of the Intellectual Foundations program at the University of Austin.
Not anymore, Alex Priyu.
Okay. We have upgraded. Previously, Howland serves as McFarlin Professor of Philosophy at the University of Tulsa and Senior Fellow at the Tikvah Fund. He's the author of 5 books and 1 edited one, including 2 on Plato's Republic, as well as studies on Kierkegaard and the Talmud. Howland's activities have appeared in the New Criterion, City Journal, and The Nation, among others. Professor Howland holds a BA from Swarthmore College and a PhD from Penn State. Please welcome Professor Howland.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I've heard Eitan speak about Exodus before, and he's an excellent interpreter of the Bible and very learned, and it's my honor to be introduced by you. Thank you. So what we're going to do today is a little bit different. We're going to read through a story together, and I'm going to stop after reading, each little chunk of the story and ask you questions or ask you for your responses, your thoughts. And someone's going to come around with a microphone. Now, this is a little bit maybe clunky, but I think it's the way to do it so that we can record your questions as well as what I might say in response. So with that, let me just jump in. Your handout has a timeline of Jewish history. Eitan's already mentioned a couple of these things, but let me just point out a couple of these dates here. The first one I want to point out is 586 BCE, so before the Common Era. and CE means Common Era, that is to say 0 AD, if you will, and beyond. 586, the first temple was destroyed. This was the temple built by Solomon, and it was destroyed by the Chaldean ruler Nebuchadnezzar, also the name of the ship in the first Matrix film. Wealthy Jewish families were deported to Babylon, and this period is called the Babylonian captivity. And it's in this period, by the way, that scholars think the Bible was first written down. Everything in the Bible was oral. And generally speaking, an oral tradition moves to a written tradition in times of crisis. So the Jews in Babylonia were worried that they would lose their tradition, so they began to write down the Bible. Although that's not completely certain, that's sort of the main theory. Okay, the next date I want to point to is the Jews were freed by Cyrus, the first Persian emperor, and they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. However, quite a few Jews remained in Babylonia, and that's going to be important for a reason I'll mention very shortly. The temple was rebuilt. That is the temple if you go to Israel today. You can go to the Temple Mount, at least at certain times, but people pray at the Western Wall of the Second Temple. Jumping forward, look to 70 CE. There was a rebellion against Rome, and Rome crushed the revolt, and the Second Temple was destroyed, and the Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, and the temple has never been rebuilt. Now, this was the beginning of the so-called diaspora, which means dispersion of the Jews from their homeland. And later that century, a rabbinical academy was built at a place called Yavne in the region called Palestine by the Romans. It's on the sea coast. So let me tell you a couple things about that. I think it's interesting to note that when the Second Temple was destroyed, Judaism faced a crisis. Because before that, there was one locus of contact with God, and that was the temple in Jerusalem. And there, priests would offer sacrifices to God, animal sacrifices. When the temple was destroyed, there was no more physical locus of contact with God. The priests were out of a job, and there were no more animal sacrifices. And it's been that way ever since. So what did the Jews do? Instead of sort of saying, okay, we're done, they decided that henceforth the locus of contact with God would be the Torah, that is, the Hebrew Scripture. And that is where people would make contact with God. They decided that instead of sacrifices, animal sacrifices, the sacrifices would be those called for by the prophets. Feed the widow and the orphan, clothe the naked. They would become moral sacrifices. And instead of priests, prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, they had people who were called scribes, and these were individuals who were adept at interpreting the Bible, the meaning of the Bible. After the destruction of the Second Temple, they were called rabbis. And so Judaism remade itself in this way, and it continues in this way to today. Another thing I want to tell you about is that an interesting thing happened during the siege of Jerusalem. The commander leading the siege, the Roman siege of Jerusalem, was a man named Vespasian. And when the Jews were starving during the Roman siege, a rabbi named Eliezer, who's going to figure prominently in this story, as Eitan has already mentioned, helped to struggle another rabbi named Yochanan to smuggle him out of Jerusalem so he could meet with Vespasian and talk to him about the fate of the Jews. And during their conversation, Rabbi Yochanan said to Vespasian, "You will be emperor one day." And Vespasian indeed became emperor. And so then Yochanan said, "Hey, do I get a favor for this prophecy?" Something like that. Or maybe Vespasian approached him. And he asked Vespasian, "Can you please allow the sages," at that time, the learned scribes were called sages. They were also called rabbis, but later. But can you allow the sages to have an academy, a judicial and study academy in the Roman region of Palestine? And Vespasian said, okay. So that's when the academy at Yavneh, Y-A-V-N-E-H, was founded. So that's kind of interesting. And then the other thing I wanted to tell you is about the major accomplishments of the sages. So if you look at the very bottom of the first page, we have a definition of Talmud. And the Talmud is composed of something called the Mishnah, which is an oral tradition applying the Torah to everyday life, including sections on civil and criminal law, marriage, food, farming, prayer, ritual purity, etc., plus the Gemara, a commentary on the Mishnah. So let me tell you a couple, like what these words mean. Talmud comes from a word stemming from the verb lamad, which means to study, and limad, which means to teach or instruct. So Talmud is studying and instructing. Mishnah, so I said the Talmud is composed of the Mishnah and the Gemara. So the Mishnah comes from a verb shana, which means to repeat, to study, to heed oral instruction, or to teach. And the Mishnah was produced, if you look at your first page, your timeline, 220 CE, the Mishnah was completed by a rabbi or a sage named Yehuda or Judah the Prince. What is the Mishnah? The Mishnah is a very strange book. It is it's a book, the vast majority of the content of which pertains to the determination of what the Jews call halacha. Now, halacha is also interesting. It comes from the verb to walk. So the halacha means law. Halacha is law, okay? Halakhic means having to do with law. So it's the walk, or to go, to walk in the ways of God, if you will. But the Mishnah has a bunch of other content, and it's over 1,000 pages long. And here's what's amazing. It was originally not written down. It was memorized. So we're dealing with a culture of serious memorization. Think of the Iliad, 14,000 lines. Milman Parry, the Greek scholar, went to Yugoslavia in the early 20th century, and he found Yugoslav bards who could recite from memory 45,000 lines or something to that effect. Isabella will know the exact total of lines. But, writing, as you learn from the Phaedrus, destroys our ability to remember things orally. So, in any case, so you have the Mishnah, and then afterwards, people decided we want a commentary on the Mishnah, particularly because the Mishnah was, in a time of crisis, produced after the destruction of the Second Temple, and these are basically laws. These are instructions for the conduct of the Jewish people. But unfortunately, they were self-standing. They were not connected with the Torah. Now, the Torah, the Bible, was viewed by the Jews as a book that had everything in it. There's a famous rabbi called Ben Bogbog, very strange name. He said, turn it and turn it, for everything is in it, in the Torah, okay? So if you want to say, here is a law according to which Jews should behave, you've got to link it with the Torah. And part of the problem is that the Mishnah didn't do that. So one of the tasks of the Gemara, the commentary on the Mishnah, was to try to connect it with the Bible. Okay. Gemara comes from the Aramaic verb, and by the way, the Talmud is written in both Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke, and Hebrew. And they're very similar, but they're not exactly the same. And it comes from the verb gemar, which means to complete, the Gemara being the completion or perfection of the Talmud. So what is the Talmud? There are two Talmuds. There is the Jerusalem Talmud, and there is the bigger and more substantial and richer Babylonian Talmud. I told you that a bunch of Jews stayed in Babylon, and they had a flourishing Jewish community there. And the sages in Babylon wrote the Babylonian Talmud, which is 2.5 million words. And originally, this is going to blow your mind, Talmud. Well, there's some debate about this, but there's a school of thought that says the Talmud, the Gemara, just like the Mishnah, was originally oral. People memorized it, okay? This is how serious they were about this stuff. But they finally wrote it down. So what is Talmud? If you read it, it's bizarre. It looks kind of like a Platonic dialogue. You read a Platonic dialogue, say there's a dialogue called the Laches, and the question is, a couple old men are talking and saying, should our sons study with this guy using this newfangled weapon. And then 2 pages later, they're talking with Socrates, and the whole question is, well, what is courage, right? The Talmud does this kind of thing. So it might start out, I like to use this example. There's, a very practical level. There's 2 plots of land. One belongs to you, one belongs to your neighbor. Your neighbor's growing tomatoes. The tomatoes lean over to your land, sort of fall onto your plot or something. Are they yours? And then a couple of pages later, why did God create the universe? They just kind of take off. So it's a freewheeling conversation that has no apparent boundaries and moves in unpredictable directions, and it touches on a vast array of topics. Profound theological observations. They have folk tales. We're going to read a very interesting story in a second. Legal discourse, magic, science, demonology, whatever. Okay, the Oven of Akhnai, which is the story we're going to look at today, is the most famous story in the Talmud. And at the center of the story is what I would call the problem and the paradox of politics. So let me explain, and I'm going to connect it with Greek thought. That's part of what I'm going to try to do today. The political problem, the Greeks and Jews of antiquity agree, is our ignorance of how to live good and peaceful lives in community. And even more important, how to negotiate answers to the question of how to live a good life without serious conflict. So that's the political problem, right? We don't know how to do those things. We lack truth on these true answers to these questions. And so that ignorance leads in the Greek tradition to philosophical inquiry, and in the Hebraic tradition to the study and interpretation of sacred texts. Very strange though, because here's the paradox. Okay, so that's the problem. How to live good lives. We need to come into the presence of the truth. We need to understand it. We need to apply it to our lives. The paradox is this, that the decisive achievement of wisdom by one or maybe a few human beings, and that's all the ancients could imagine, that no more than a very few human beings could achieve wisdom, real knowledge of the truth, is politically undesirable. Let me repeat, it's politically undesirable for one or only a few human beings to achieve wisdom. That's because communities can be destroyed not only by ignorance. Obviously, if you're ignorant of how to live a good life or even how to negotiate conflicts about those questions, your community is going to not flourish. But in fact, they can be destroyed by the immediate presence of the truth in the form of the perfected wise person. That's the paradox of politics. So the Oven of Akhnai addresses that paradox, and it takes place at the Rabbinical Academy of Yavne that I mentioned, was the gift that Rabbi Yochanan got from Vespasian. And it concerns a debate among a group of scholars and judges who were the leaders of the Jewish community. And in this story, there is one perfectly wise man. This is not in dispute. He is the wise man, and his name is Rabbi Eliezer. And in this story, he is excommunicated. He is kicked out of the Rabbinical Academy, and so is God. God is told, see ya, we got nothing to do with you. Stay out of our business. It's incredible. And the story makes clear that the living God is excluded from all discussions of the meaning of the law that God has given. He's out of the picture. It also makes clear the necessity of what you might call these ostracisms of Rabbi Eliezer and of God. And it also makes clear their great cost, because the Oven of Akhnai is shot through with violence and suffering, which are the unavoidable consequences of rejecting truth in favor of either falsehood or the distinct possibility of falsehood. So what I'd like to do is go to the text, turn to the page. We're going to start with just a very small part on the first page, where the second arrow, 4 lines from the bottom. And by the way, this is the translation of Rabbi Aden Steinsaltz. It's meant to look like a page of Talmud, although most of it's in English. You've got the main text here, then you've got Rashi, a commentator, down here, and then you have in English comments and things around. If you look at a page of Talmud, it looks like that. It's a commentary on the Mishnah and the Gemara. And so here's what it says. It says, we learned, this is 4 lines from the bottom of the main text in the middle of the page, we learned in a Mishnah taught elsewhere that there's a difference of opinion regarding an oven. If someone cut an earthenware oven horizontally into ring-shaped pieces and then reconstructed it and put sand between the pieces, afterwards spreading clay on the oven to join the pieces together, turn the page, Rabbi Eliezer declares the resulting oven ritually pure, i.e. not susceptible to ritual impurity, because in his opinion, the oven is no longer regarded as a complete utensil and is therefore no longer susceptible to ritual impurity. Now let me explain what's going on. On this page, you got a picture of an oven. Everybody see that on the right-hand side? At that time, the communities used communal ovens. These were big objects. And the problem is that, let's say some polluted creature like a scorpion, lots of those around in the Middle East, crawls into the oven and dies or something along the oven wall. The oven would ordinarily be rendered ritually impure. But not the entire oven, according to Rabbi Eliezer, because this oven is exactly the sort he's talking about. You see, it has these rings, and in between the rings, there's sand. And so let's say the scorpion crawled into the bottom and died on the bottom there. All you would have to do is replace the bottom ring. If the entire oven is rendered impure, you got to tear the whole oven down and replace it, and that's expensive. So Rabbi Eliezer's position is that kind of oven is not susceptible to ritual impurity. It's a nifty solution. It's economical. It avoids all kinds of problems. Okay? That's his opinion. And I need to tell you this about Rabbi Eliezer. He was understood, as I said, to be a wise man. They said of him, there's a lot of writings, rabbinic writings about Eliezer. They described him as a plastered cistern that loses not a drop of what he has been taught. Okay? And there's no question in the story, he knows. He is the one who has knowledge. Now, I'm going to continue reading on the right-hand side. On the left is Adin Steinsaltz's kind of explanation of the literal translation that's on the right. But I think I'm just going to read what's on the right in a chunk, and then we'll talk about it, because it's clear enough. Okay, so let me read this, and I want you to think about what questions this text raises for you. What is Akhnai? Okay, that's number 2. So on the right-hand side, then, we've got Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, because they encircled him with words like this snake and declared it ritually impure. Now, Achna is a snake, okay? So Yehuda is saying they encircled Rabbi Eliezer like a snake, right? And kind of dominated him. This is what the other rabbis did. Okay, there's a lot there, but we can go on. It has been taught, on that day, Rabbi Eliezer used all the arguments in the world, but they did not accept them from him. He said to them, if the halacha, the law, is in accordance with me, let this carob tree prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. That's a long way. So a cubit is this, right? So we're talking, 400 or 500 feet, whatever. They said to him, one does not bring proof from a carob tree. He then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with me, let the channel of water prove it. The channel of water turned backward. They said to him, one does not bring proof from a channel of water. He then said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with me, let the walls of the house of study prove it. By the way, they're in the house of study, okay? Let the walls of the house of study prove it. The walls of the house of study leaned to fall. Rabbi Yehoshua rebuked them. Is this getting crazy enough for you? Rebuked them and said to them, if Talmudic sages argue with one another about the halacha, what affair is it of yours? They did not fall out of respect for Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning. All right, let's stop there. What do you think about this? What's going on here? Why didn't they? Yeah, so we got our hand up right back here. Yeah. So here comes a microphone. This is going to take a little while, but this is what we're going to do.
So with the walls initially starting to fall, and then this other rabbi saying like, no, don't listen to that rabbi. Like, this is not your business. They stop falling halfway. But isn't the fact that they're like deviating from their natural situation of being perfectly upright still them adhering more towards Rabbi Eliezer?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. The walls are in a bad position, right? Like, what do we do here, But what do you think of the fact that the walls are falling to begin with? Like, what would happen if they obeyed him completely? everybody in the house of study would be dead. The walls would fall on the sages. That's not good. Eliezer is quite upset. What else do you notice here? Like, why? Like, do you have any, like, what's up with the miracles? And how come they aren't taken as proof that God is on Eliezer's side? We have a hand up here.
So the story makes clear that Eliezer has the best knowledge. It talks about he's the pot that has all the water. But it's his arguments that are insufficient. And I think it's a question of, is it insufficient for himself? Like, does he have an obligation for himself to come up with the best articulation arguments? It seems also clear, it seems at least clear that they're insufficient to convince the majority, to convince the sages, which this story is kind of offensive to my individualism of saying, like, as a philosopher, I'm trying to achieve knowledge, I'm trying to pursue. But this is saying, no, when in matters concerning the law, how you should live, whatever, that it's not about achieving knowledge, but being able to convince the majority. Is that democratic? Is that saying something about reality? Because there's at least a difference between that reality exists according to this person's understanding. There is something, like Eliezer's right. There is something true. It's not just relative to the sages, but at least in how they act and how they continue to worship or live as Jews, that it is dependent on the social recognition of what the truth is.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I appreciate that comment very much. First of all, let me say that Eliezer is not the only sage who is able to perform miracles. And the understanding is that that all miracles come from God, okay? So it's sort of got a special line to God. And in this case, we might say that God is showing that Eliezer, in fact, is right. Now, you said that he didn't give good arguments, or I think you suggested that. I would like to suggest that that is extremely improbable. And it is furthermore extremely improbable that the sages did not understand that they were good arguments. Well, it says, no, I mean, what does it say? It says, let's see exactly. They did not accept them from him. That's what it says. Now, here's why I claim it's highly unlikely. Because Eliezer is the greatest rabbinic sage in the world. And that means that the arguments are really, really good. Because he's really good at this game, okay? The game is, and what is rabbinic argument? Here's why this is the law. I connect it with either the tradition that came before, which is pretty young at this point, although it's, maybe a couple centuries old because there were other, famous thinkers, scribes, and so forth, or directly with the Bible, or both. So my hypothesis is they're really good arguments. And my other hypothesis is the other sages are not stupid. They're called sages. And they know they're good arguments. What I'm trying to tell you is this is a political action. My suggestion is they don't want Eliezer. It's not what he's saying. It's the man. He's got to go. I want to throw that out. That guy has to go, number one. Number two, what we see in this, and I'll explain why that might be the case, or we'll discuss it. What we see in this is another thing, which is miracles aren't arguments. I love this part, right? When they say to him, one does not bring proof from a carob tree, from a stream, from study house walls or whatever, they're saying miracles are not probative. They are irrelevant in the context of academic debate on matters of law. Right? That's the game. It's not about showing that you got a line to God and you can pull off miracles. It's about the arguments, okay? By the way, I would also like to point out, these miracles are shot through with hostility. Study house walls, definitely. Carob trees in, this region of the world was impoverished, and it was a fundamental staple of the people. it's like destroying wheat or something. And water in the Middle East, pretty important too. So he's like directly, and we're going to see him later destroying a third of all the crops in the world, right? So like this guy is threatening the sources of life and even the bodies of the other sages. Why? Because he's angry. Why is he angry? Because he knows he's right. And why the heck aren't these people listening? And if he can't prevail, he's willing to burn the whole place down, so to speak. So let's read the next part. I think this will become clear. This is really amazing. He then said, this is Eliezer, to them, if the halakha is in accordance with me, let it be proved from heaven. A heavenly voice. In the Hebrew, this is a bat kol. Like the phrase means a daughter of a voice. But we're to understand that this is God. Okay? A heavenly voice went forth and said, why are you disputing with Rabbi Eliezer? For the halakha, law, is in accordance with him everywhere. In other words, he's always right on matters of law. Rabbi Yehoshua rose to his feet and said, it is not in heaven. Turn the page. What does it is not in heaven mean? Rabbi Yirmiyah said that the Torah was already given on Mount Sinai, and we do not pay attention to a heavenly voice, for you already wrote in the Torah at Mount Sinai after the majority to incline. Okay? So when this man stands up and it adds on his feet to kind of emphasize, it's not in heaven. It means stay out of it. You gave us the Torah. You got no say in this argumentation anymore. That's kind of wild. By the way, it is not in heaven. He's referring to a passage from the Bible in chapter 30 of Deuteronomy. And that passage reads, basically says that the instruction of God is not in heaven. It is not too wondrous or too distant. That means it's not too difficult for you to do. This is what the passage means. God is saying to the Jewish people, it's not in heaven. It's not too difficult for you. It is very close to you, in your heart and in your mouth to do it. Okay? So what's happened here is, well, let me stop and ask you, like, what are your thoughts about this? I mean, the voice of God has said, this dude is right. And they tell him, get lost. You got no part in this. What do you think about that? Does that strike you as odd? Got a hand up here.
Isn't there also a verse in Deuteronomy that says, I believe it's Moses speaking, and he says, let me not hear the voice of God again, lest I die? So that would serve to prove the other rabbi's point. And also in Deuteronomy 4, I believe, it says, you shall not add or subtract to the law that I've given you. So, I mean, you could make a fairly compelling case that they're adding to this law of their own accord and not of God.
Okay, so let me ask you, can we just follow up on that for a second? First of all, your first citation, I would have to look at the context to have any opinion about whether that might apply to this. But your second point, you can't add or subtract to the law. Can you just tell me, Alexander, are you saying that, like, what are you saying? Are you saying that the rabbis are in the wrong because they're adding, or like, can you sort of draw the conclusion there? I'm not clear on where you're going with it.
I'm saying that you could make the case that because this is an applied case of the law that's not explicitly, clarified in the written law or in the given law from God directly, then you could say that technically any clarification could be adding to the law.
Okay, so this is a real problem. The law remains the same, but the trick is, let's go back to the claim that turn it and turn it, for everything is in it. I compare it to the Constitution. We are guided in this country by the Constitution, the fundamental law of the land. The Constitution does not cover everything. So the skill then becomes one of interpretation to find, for example, a right to abortion in the Constitution. And that is sort of the rabbinical skill. In other words, there is nothing in the Bible about what to do with an oven that's divided into parts that is, in fact, rendered impure or not. So they got to figure it out on their own. And that's the whole skill of argumentation, right? Now, by the way, this is why they really develop skills of interpretation, right? Like what passage, and they're really inventive. Oh my goodness. I mean, they'll pull this from here and here and here, and then it shows it is impure or it's not, right? So, but the law has got to remain the same, right? Like that, the law, the teaching, the Torah, that doesn't change, right? But what I'm really interested in, and I think there was a hand up here, was like, isn't this bizarre that God doesn't have any role in this, according to these rabbis? There was a hand here somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really bizarre. I mean, in one sense, it seems that they're not even interested in God. Like they're not religious, they're not Jewish anymore. They're just lawyers, you know. But also, it seems like a fallacy to say that the Torah, which came from God, supersedes God, meaning like the part is greater than the whole, which is impossible.
So this is really interesting. So what's happening here is it actually has a Greek feel, this whole story. It's an act of parricide, metaphorically speaking. By the way, Rabbi Akiva is going to show up in this story, and he was a student of Eliezer's. He's going to play an important role. And so Eliezer being kicked out is kind of like the younger generation sort of taking over. But God is being kicked out. And the interesting question is then, how can I put it? Their conception of their community is one that would not be directly ruled by God. Like, you can kick out Eliezer. Let me put it this way. If Eliezer has to be kicked out, then so does God, because God's like a super Eliezer, right? So the problem we have to confront is, why can't you have one dude who's always right in your community? Here we have a comment. Thank you.
This feels very similar to Jesus, like he's supposed to be right in every situation, and even a heavenly voice coming and saying that he is right, or like God in the form of a heavenly dove coming down and saying, "This is my beloved son," and then the rabbis being really upset against him, and like, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, in standing up to God, Yahshua says, in effect, that he has no right, God has no right ever to intervene in the sage's work, right? You're done. You gave us the Torah, you're done. And he doesn't exactly speak truth to power, he speaks power to truth, so to speak. That is, his declaration is actually like the miracles of Eliezer. So Eliezer's like, I made that carob tree jump, so I must be right. They're like, that's not an argument. Yahshua doesn't give an argument. He just says, you're out. It's essentially an assertion of the inviolable right of the sages to be wrong. Right? That's what they're saying. We don't need Mr. Wise Man around. We're kicking him out. Now, the cost of that is going to be you're going to make mistakes. In fact, you're making a mistake right now with this oven, because God himself has said this guy's right. So now the question is, why would you do that? We got to think politically here. Like, why would you do that? And in fact, Yahshua proves by his very citation of this majority rule. He says, after the majority to incline, it turns out he's citing a passage from the Bible whose plain sense is, I'm sorry, that's not it. When he says, it is not in heaven, that passage doesn't have anything to do with this question. It really just means that the Israelites are capable of obedience. So it's very strange. Let's keep now the question sort of in the background, right? We won't forget it. Why would they have to kick this guy out? Let me read the next section about God's response. Rabbi Natan met Elijah. Now, Elijah's the guy who's taken up to heaven, and he sort of shows up a lot of the time. And he met Elijah and said to him, "What did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time?" He said to him, he smiled. God smiled and said, "My sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me." That's pretty cool. They said, that day they brought all the objects that Rabbi Eliezer had declared ritually pure and burned them in a fire. And they voted. about him, and they excommunicated him. The Talmud puts it in a nice way. They blessed him, right? They excommunicated him. So not only did they tell God, you stay out of it, not only did they not accept the arguments from Eliezer, who knows the truth, they burned all the objects, which either purified them or destroyed them. I'm not sure which. And they excommunicated this guy. You're out. Now, bad stuff's going to happen because Eliezer can perform miracles, right? There's going to be blood on the floor. But this is an existential conflict. What do you make of God's response? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Well, let me just throw this out. God responds in a very gracious way, right? You've defeated me. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't kill people. That's exactly what Eliezer does. Because Eliezer is righteously indignant, and he has every right to be upset. Now, does that mean he should kill people? No. But God shows how we ought to take these defeats. Well, okay. I love it, right? He laughs, he smiles. There's some traditions in which you won't find God laughing or smiling, or even able to take a joke, but not Judaism. What do you make about this excommunication, though? Let's get down to business. Yeah, we got a couple hands up back here. Oh, you have a bunch of hands. Great.
Is it possible that the reason they want to excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer is because they'll be out of a job and they won't have anything to do? Because doesn't God say that, listen to him in all things, or he's right? And if they can't argue, what do they do?
I think it's exactly correct. If you've got one person who is wise, who knows the truth, then all the rabbis are out of a job. Let's put that in a slightly less economic way, or however. Their existence as learned sages is utterly irrelevant. All that remains for them to do is to obey Eliezer. I'll stop with that. Merrick.
Why is it that Rabbi Eliezer felt the necessity of bringing in the Lord to his arguments and citing these miracles when he when he could have continued to argue pragmatically and economically, and the other rabbis would have had to notice that they'd have more money if they kept the ovens in Eliezer's style? It's less politically safe to bring the Lord into it. So why didn't he just keep talking about the economics?
He could keep talking, but we're told, I think the story suggests that he's totally exasperated. I gave him all the good arguments. They're not listening. And my suggestion again is, it's not about the arguments. It's about, we got to get this dude out of here. Because if we don't, well, we're out of a job, if you want to put it that way. Go ahead.
Why is it that if you know you're going to be exiled for disagreeing with the rest of the rabbis, then why is the oven the hill that you die on?
I can only speculate, but I would say that matters of law are matters of law. And these are very law-abiding people, and they want to do the right thing. And it doesn't matter if it's an oven or a kettle or your neighbor's tomato plant or whatever. And Eliezer knows he's right.
I will say, I don't think the sages were they come to the conclusion they come to, which is different than Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, but I don't think they have some sort of malignant intent to get him to make the miracles happen. They just interpret the law in a different way. And building off of that, the story is Rabbi Eliezer does not want to agree with the majority. Therefore, he's violating the Torah verse that's cited. I did read ahead a little bit, but essentially, like 239, we didn't kick him out for my own honor or for my father's honor. We kicked him out for your honor, God, because you told us to trend after the majority, and if not, controversies are going to multiply in Israel. There can't just be one guy that does something different than what the majority does. So it is political. If you have one guy that is constantly going against the majority, that's bad for everybody. but it's also about the law. And so, yes, the sages have the right to make mistakes, but that's what it means when it says you should go after the majority.
Yeah, now this is going to freak you out. The passage that it's connected to in the Bible, at least according to Adin Steinsaltz and the commentators that I've studied, maybe not Steinsaltz, but anyway, the commentators, is actually claims that you should not incline. You should not follow the majority. Okay. Like, in other words, they're proving that they're wrong. Like, it's so bizarre. But let me just say this. I don't think they were trying to goad him into doing miracles or something. I think their plan all along was to kick this dude out permanently.
Why would the sages, they just didn't like this guy?
Just going back, I mean, let's get one more comment. Let's get McKenna here, because maybe she's got some light to shed on this, and then I'll tell you what I think.
I just want to comment on God smiling at this, and how he's smiling that they have more loyalty to the Torah than to even using the force of God to change reality.
That's great. I love that. I hadn't thought about that. I think that's very interesting, you know. And the fact is that Eitan already said that there were these stages in Judaism. There was the time, which you've been reading about in Genesis and Exodus, when God speaks directly to the people. Then there's a time when he communicates to the prophets. The age of prophecy is over by now. It's gone. God does not, except in these weird Talmudic stories, right? You're like, well, wait a second, Professor Howland, God's doing it here. Okay, this is a story. It's a story. But let me put it this way. Even if it weren't a story, even if we're like, hey, even then God's talking to them, God hasn't talked to any Jews for a very long time. All you got is the Torah. That's what lasts. So I love your point, right? Like, you are left with that, and you need to work with that. And how do you work with it? Well, the rabbis have established the pattern. Think about it, interpret it, apply it, just like the Supreme Court has done with the Constitution. But here's my thought, and here's where I want to connect it with the Greeks. Aristotle, in his Politics, Book 3, Chapter 13, you might have read this, says that a polis, a political community, is one in which citizens share in ruling and being ruled under the law, okay? And he says in that chapter, one whose excess of virtue is so great as to be incommensurable with the virtue and political capacity of others can no longer be counted as part of the city. Okay, so if you have someone who's extremely excellent, far beyond everyone else, you got to do one of two things. You got to either make that person king, or you have to ostracize him. And the reason, if you make him king, here's the problem. You no longer are citizens in a political community, because to be a citizen is to rule and be ruled, to be ruled and rule, right? It's not a political community. This is what needs to be understood here. To have one person directing you all, like daddy directing 3-year-olds. You're going to wear that. You're going to do this. That is not a political community. And that's why kingship is very hard to disentangle from tyranny in Aristotle, but that's another question. So if you want a political community where people develop as citizens, develop their capacities for self-rule, for agency, for participation in a community where other people's voices matter, like UATX, where we can debate and discuss things and bring our own opinions and let the best arguments prevail, then you cannot have that one person who's better than everyone else. And in Eliezer's case, the problem is he's the wisest. This is never questioned. The guy is always right. So not only are they out of a job, this story is telling us that to be a sage, or more broadly, a Jew, is to develop your own capacities, your own capabilities, even at the cost of being wrong. That's better. And maybe that's why God's smiling too. That's better than being infantile and being ruled by the one wise person who's channeling God. Does that make sense? So they got to kick this guy out. This is a battle to the death. And I have to tell you, by the way, my interpretation of this is, I mean, I don't want to, I don't know anyone else who's interpreted it this way politically, but I think that's what's going on in this story. I think it's going on in this story. But once you do that, we get the second part of the story, which is blood. So we'll go through that quickly because I realize that we're running out of time and we could have some more time for questions. So I'm going to continue with the last 3 lines on that page, 237. And they said, "Who will go and inform him?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "I will go, lest someone who is unsuitable will go and inform him. And as a result, he will destroy the entire world." Like now they're freaked out, like, okay, we got him out. But the dude has a line to God and he might destroy the whole world. And Akiva, by the way, is known. He is known to be not only a student of Eliezer, but uniquely sympathetic and forgiving. And the guy who's the best person to try to soften his intellectual father's potentially world-destroying rage. And in fact, there's a passage in the Talmud that compares Akiva with Eliezer, and it says, Akiva was no greater than Eliezer, but unlike Eliezer, he, quote, forbears to retaliate, end quote. Okay, so he goes to him, and here's what he does. What does Rabbi Akiva do? He dressed in black garments and wrapped himself in black and sat before him at a distance of 4 cubits, which is apparently ritually required when you're dealing with someone excommunicated. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, "Akiva, what is the difference between today and any other day?" He said to him, "Rabbi, it seems to me that your colleagues are staying away from you." He too rent his garments and took off his shoes and slipped on and sat on the ground. His eyes streamed with tears. The world was smitten. 1/3 of the olives, 1/3 of the wheat, and 1/3 of the barley. And some say that even the dough in a woman's hands swelled, which means it would not be useful anymore. And what do you make of this part? What does that remind you of, him rending the clothes and so forth? Yeah.
It kind of reminds me when God in Judges keeps giving the Israelites into the hands of more subjugators and puts them and kind of punishes them for their disobedience.
Oh, so you're talking about when he destroys the crops and stuff like that.
Or also just when the Israelites whore after another god and then they're put under subjugation again.
Yeah. But what about, if I have you, can you answer this or make a suggestion? What about, like, what does that look like? They tear their clothes and they take their shoes off and they sit there and they're...
Well, isn't that what mourning?
Yeah, exactly. That's the ritual of Shiva. That's mourning, as if someone has died. So he's sitting there and mourning. What's he mourning? Maybe the metaphorical death of Eliezer he's gone from the community. Maybe the metaphorical death of God, right? Like God's out there too, right? But, okay, so let's keep going so that we have some time for further discussion. A Tanah taught, now this means it's another story, Mishnaic story. There was a great calamity on that day, for every place upon which Rabbi Eliezer laid his eyes was burnt. See, this guy is radioactive. Like, you do not want to be anywhere near Eliezer at this point. And Rabban Gamaliel, too. And Rabban Gamaliel, by the way, is the head of the Rabbinical Academy at Yavna. Now, that might be a little strange because Eliezer's the star, but Rabban Gamaliel is the head. He's the administrator. And Rabban Gamaliel, too, was coming on a ship, and a wave rose up against him to drown him. He said, "It seems to me that this is only because of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hirkanas." He rose to his feet and said, "Master of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that I did not do this for my own honor, nor did I do it for the honor of my father's house, but for your honor, so that controversies will not multiply in Israel." The sea rested from its wrath. And then let's read to the end of the story. Ima Shalom, Rabbi Eliezer's wife, was Rabban Gamaliel's sister. Now this is interesting, okay? So Eliezer's wife is named Ima Shalom, and her name literally means mother peace. Mother peace. And she's going to play the role that Akiva plays between contending parties. And she's going to try to do that. And so her brother-in-law is Rabban Gamaliel, and her husband is Eliezer. From that incident onward, she did not let Rabbi Eliezer fall on his face. Okay, so here's what you need to know. At certain times, according to Jewish tradition, you could fall on your face and pray to God and your prayer would be answered. And she didn't want him to fall on his face because she didn't want him to kill her brother. Okay? I'm sorry, not brother-in-law, brother, right? She's Gamaliel's sister. One day it was the new moon and she mistook a full month for a short one. Some say a poor person came and stood at the door and she brought out bread for him. She found him fallen on his face, and she said to him, "Rise, you have killed my brother." Meanwhile, the sound of a horn came from Rabban Gamaliel's house that he had died. He said to her, where did you know?" She said to him, "I have this tradition from my grandfather's house. All the gates are locked except for the gates of ona'ah." And ona'ah means publicly shaming somebody. So what that means is that Ima Shalom tells Eliezer, there is a tradition that if you have been publicly shamed, God will listen to your prayers. And so what we're meant to understand is that for some reason, and by the way, this question of did she mistake the day of the month, it comes down to this. She might have miscalculated the calendar, which is a theoretical mistake, or she made a practical mistake, which is she tended to the hungry stranger instead of keeping an eye on Eliezer. What's the theoretical mistake? The first day of the new month, she thought it was the first day of the new month when it was the last day of the old one. The last day of the old month is a particularly propitious date for supplication, for supplicating prayers, right? So there's a couple things going on. That last day of the month, on the last day of the month, God opens his ears and listens to you. So either she made a theoretical mistake and she thought it was the first day of the new month, and that's why he was able to do it. Or some people say a hungry stranger came to the door and she fed him, right? Which would be a practical mistake. But she made a mistake. Or maybe I would say she was forced to choose between caring for the stranger and protecting her brother, which would really be a tragic alternative, in which case, she chose to help the stranger. But what I want to point out here is she teaches Eliezer something. This is amazing. This guy is the most learned man in the world. He's like, how'd you know? She says, well, I've got this tradition that all the gates are locked except for the gates of public shame. God listens to you. Maybe, and by the way, she doesn't lash out. Like, we don't know what their marriage is going to be like. I think it's going to be a tough one. It's going to be a bad night, right? Like, okay, let's talk about my brother, whom you killed. But what's interesting is the last vision we have of them is he's teaching, she's teaching, and he's learning. It's so strange. So let me now ask you just any thoughts or questions about this whole story? Like, what do you think about this idea that, I will say this, in Judaism, the dignity and development of each human being is more important than everybody being right. But the tragedy is that if you kick the person who knows the truth out of your community, not only are you going to upset that person, and that's going to be a problem, but you are ultimately going to have suffering because you're not living completely in accordance with the truth.
I wanted to say two things. So just on your last comment now, I mean, the Chabad movement had the Rebbe. He was an example of, all the people who came before him and his family, they all knew this truth, like they had the right thing. And so that didn't undermine the internal challenges of Jews, overcoming their Yetzer Hara or their evil inclinations. The second thing that I want to say, it's possible that it's not a political reason, but actually this anger that he shows could be not just a one-time thing. Like maybe he had a past of anger. And the reason why I say that is the name of his wife, Ima Shalom. And it's possible that Mother Peace is alluding to the fact that, these rabbis are exiling him because of safety reasons.
Okay, that's really interesting. So let me take up that last point. One of the things we know about Eliezer is he was a very promising young man, and he always wanted to study. And his father was a sort of tyrannical rich man. And he said, no, you can't go to Jerusalem and study. You can't. You stay here and work. And so he ran away, goes to Jerusalem, immediately proves himself to be the most brilliant student they've ever had. He becomes famous. All the rich people in Jerusalem come to celebrate him and to dine with him. And it's that day that his father shows up. And he's like, this is my son. And he says, get lost, Dad. It's really interesting. It's the same thing that they do to him. He's like, I'm going to paraphrase here, but it's like, you're not my father. God is my father. I don't need you. Like, it's really, so that is interesting because it kind of supports your point of view. Like, this guy himself is ready to commit parricide, if you will, against his actual father, and to declare himself, if you will, a son of God. He's full of pride. He's not the only person in the Talmud who thinks he's a son of God. I can point to other stories that you may be familiar with, including one about Honi the circle drawer and whatever. But so that's kind of interesting. He definitely has anger management issues, right? I mean, partly this is a story about, like, again, the contrast between God, who's like, my sons have overcome me. He laughs, he smiles. And this guy, I think God's a better example, you know? Now, another thing I want to tell you is that the Talmud is very concerned about academic politics, if I can put it that way. We have rabbinical academies, and there's a famous story about a guy riding a donkey. He's riding a donkey, and he's like, I am so smart, and I have so much learning, and I'm so amazing. And he runs into the ugliest man he's ever seen. And he says to the ugly man, whoa, you know, like, are all the people from whatever town you came from as ugly as you? Why are you so ugly? And the guy says, I don't know. Why don't you go ask my maker? And the rabbi's like, whoa, I screwed up here. And that ugly man follows him to the place he's going, says, that guy insulted me, blah, blah. And that rabbi learns his lesson that day, right? So the Talmud's typical. It has these stories about people who are all puffed up, and they're just so awesome, right? And how they fight with each other. And in fact, sometimes the fighting is exactly like this. It's really violent. And they warn against that kind of self-promotion and pride. And it's a big issue. It is a big issue. Just as big an issue as the modern academy, frankly. Humility is important. We got another hand. Great. I didn't answer your first part, but we can talk about that later.
Should UATX practice ostracism?
If we find someone who is always right and never wrong, then we can discuss it. I haven't run into any of those.
So it seems like when we're talking about Rabbi Eliezer lashing out against these other rabbis, it's like we're attributing it to him, where Eliezer killed his brother-in-law. But it actually seems like if he's praying, it's God that's killing his brother-in-law, and it's God that's burning the oil, the fields and destroying a third of the olive. And so I guess I'm wondering if he protected them once and didn't let the walls collapse, and he recognizes the fact that his sons has defeated him, why is it that he still does Eliezer's bidding, I guess?
And thank you for raising it. God is on both sides of this issue. He's on both sides of this issue. And why is he on both sides? Because God is concerned with truth. And Eliezer is the possessor of truth. And God is concerned with the political community. And so he's in a tough position. But you're absolutely right. He plays both sides. He plays both sides. It's really interesting. God's actions are themselves a statement of the problem, right? You know, because this is a tragic choice. Like, good news, we've got the wise man right here. It's like Plato's Republic or something. Let that guy rule. Yeah, if you want a totally dominated society where no one's free and they just obey. Okay, that's a problem. Then kick the wise guy out. Yeah, if you want a society where a bunch of fools are making laws. I mean, I'm being exaggerating, right? The sages are not fools. But you can, there's just trade-offs. And there's no... But what I want to suggest is this is the story of the foundation of this academy as a political community. Like, this is the foundation story here. It's amazing. And I would just throw this out. If you want a similar story, think about the story in the Oresteia with the Furies, whose tears drip poison and they need to be dealt with, and the foundation of the homicide court and of that community. We have Professor Priyu in the back with his hand up.
I was just approached by Associate Provost Lauren Rotner to defend the man who's always right and never wrong from being ostracized. And so you cited Aristotle, Book 3, Chapter 13, but that's just as I'm sure you're aware, just a moment in the argument. By the time he gets to chapter 17, he's like, you know what? Yeah, if you have somebody this good, just let him rule. Everybody back. So he actually ultimately succumbs to the temptation. It seems like, at least at that moment in the argument, to have the excellent person rule. So if we follow biblical wisdom, we should ostracize that person. If we follow Greek wisdom, we should keep that person in. How do we square those two?
Well, I square it by insisting on my right to be wrong about Aristotle. Any other questions?
If I'm not mistaken, Eliezer never invokes the name of the Lord until he asks for a sign directly from heaven. He just says, this carob tree will prove me right, or this stream will prove me right. And so that would seem to imply that this is not coming directly from God. In the same way that we see in Exodus, the Pharaoh's court is able to do these miracles that are, until a certain point, equated with Aaron's and with Moses's. So how are we supposed to, justify the claim that these signs are from God and are not from some other force?
There is one piece of evidence in here, just within the text itself. It's when Rabban Gamaliel sees the waves and stands up and says, he says to God directly, Master of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that I did not do this for my own honor, blah, blah, blah. And then the sea rested from its wrath. So that suggests, that it actually is God, because he addresses God. Everybody understands it to be God, if you will. And the other thing is that Talmudic rabbis are, generally speaking, very worried about miracles. So, for example, what's the equivalent of the pharaonic magicians in the Talmud? It's witches. And there is, actually, in another Talmudic story, there's a leader of the Sanhedrin. So this is much earlier. This is when the temple was still in existence, named Shimon ben Shattach. And Shimon ben Shattach is famous for having burned to death 70 witches in a place called Ashkelon. Why didn't they like witches? Because witches, I think you could ignore let's suppose today we had a coven of witches come in. I think most of us wouldn't say let's burn them, because we're not really concerned that the coven of witches is going to, do any bad magic, right? But the sages were. That is to say, they didn't want people exercising illicit powers, calling up ghosts from the ground Samuel, who comes up from the ground when the witch of Endor. By the way, there was a TV show that only the older folks in the room will know. It was called Bewitched. And the witch, I think her name was Endora, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, so the witch of Endor. But the witch of Endor calls up, so Saul is about to be killed, and the witch of Endor calls up Samuel, the ghost of Samuel. But they didn't like witches, because they believed that they had some capacity. So I'm just the very spirit of the thing, it would be inconceivable to regard Rabbi Eliezer as exercising these illicit minor powers. I mean, but again, we also have Gamaliel's statement here. Merrick.
Is the sorry, it's loud. Is the academy at Yavne keeping the Jewish people docile? Is it almost effectively the Romans have allowed them to have this academy where they go to bicker about ovens and tomato plants and witches so that they don't take revenge for the destruction of the Second Temple? Is it a kind of a political way of keeping the Jewish people from rebelling?
That's an interesting suggestion. I would say it's historically entirely implausible, because the Romans could just crush these guys. We have Rabbi Akiva here. It's really a sad story. I'll tell you a little bit about Rabbi Akiva. In 135, I think I have it on my sheet. Let's see, where is it? The 135, 2 to 135, a Jewish rebellion, the Bar Kokhba revolt is put down by the Romans. So they already tried that. And this guy Bar Kokhba thought he could overthrow the Romans. And Rabbi Akiva threw his weight behind Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Akiva was caught, and the Romans did what the Romans did best. They put they tied him up. They put wool soaked in water around him, and they put him on a pyre, and they burned him to death. Why the wool soaked in water? So he'd stay alive longer, so he'd be tortured. And while he was being burned alive, Rabbi Akiva recited the Shema. It's a famous prayer in Judaism. And his disciples, who are all standing around weeping, saying, "How can you say the Shema now? Like, how can you praise God?" And he said, "Now is the first time I know that I really mean it." Yeah, pretty interesting. That's an interesting story of martyrdom. But your question has a kind of larger scope, which is these guys are sitting around and they're not really, I mean, I've given you a political reading, but they're not really doing politics. They're just doing their thing. And it's a very interesting question because, for millennia, the Jews had no power. And in Babylonia, for example, and in, Roman Palestine, they didn't have any power. And so, like, bad news, good news, right? We don't have any power, but we don't have to worry about that stuff. We can just study all day, right? Like, we don't have any power anyway. The first time the Jews ever got power again was when? Speak up. Well, ever got power again after the diaspora. 1948, State of Israel. And a lot, that fact that now you've got these Jews who have political power created real waves and real problems, because now you've got a state. And it's one thing to think and debate and really plumb the depths of morality and try to live the best, most just life. But then you got a state, and you got to fight war, and you got all these other issues. And it's a real change that the Jewish people have had to adjust to and try to figure out what to do about that. Now, fortunately, they're still guided by the kind of prophetic spirit. And that's why the Israeli army has an extensive code of morality. And they have officers embedded with every armed unit to make sure. And they actually have the power to stop various military actions if they claim that this is in violation of their code of ethics. But it's a real problem. It's an interesting question. Yeah.
So if Rabbi Eliezer actually is the Son of God or a Son of God, why does he exhibit so few of the qualities of the Old Covenant, yet he makes so many references? And by the Old Covenant, I mean the one Moses gave on Mount Sinai. But he gives so many references and clear references and then arguments that further it.
Can you expand a little bit on your saying him not observing the Old Covenant, or
like the fact that he decides to kill his brother-in-law, right? Or the fact that he is irritable and may have anger issues.
He's a human being. What can I tell you, David? I mean, it's like he's a flawed man.
That's what I mean. Like how does it parallel the fact that if he would be the Son of God?
Well, no. I mean, let me stress here. This is metaphorical, right? That is to say, God's my father. Like, I'm following him. But you're pointing to a very interesting issue. His excellence is in determining matters of Jewish law. And that has a practical outcome, but it is a theoretical excellence. So what we're dealing with is someone who is displaying serious theoretical excellence and is fundamentally morally flawed. An example from the modern period would be Martin Heidegger, who was, either Wittgenstein or Heidegger, you can take your pick, one of the top two philosophers in the 20th century. And he also happened to be a Nazi. Might be a little weak. But that's a problem, right? And Eliezer is a human being. He's got theoretical excellence. He's the dude. He just has a lot of other problems as well. Professor Hofpower. And don't ask me anything about Aristotle. I'm just kidding.
But it's picking up where you just left us. And so is there an alternative to humility at the end, though? Is there another sort of knowledge that might be acquired? The practical application of the theoretical wisdom. I'm still thinking that there is significance to the oven which should produce good things, which become good by way of the oven, but there's another consideration, purity and impurity there. And then I'm wondering if there's another sort of knowledge that might be attained of how it is to then apply that lesson of making that which is held to be good also pure, rather than just racing to humility.
That's a very well phrased question. I appreciate that. And of course, it points back to Aristotle, because what we're really talking about is practical wisdom. I think Akiva demonstrates, of all people in the story, a kind of practical wisdom. Yes, I see the time. I'm going to stop. So I will just answer your question saying, yes, that's possible. I mean, that I think is one of the things. I love the way you said purity and impurity. You pointed out the oven produces good things. You know, yes, we want to purify ourselves of these bad tendencies. And so there's always something to be learned. Eliezer himself, I like these last two questions, okay? Because what they do is they point to the fact that this man is a flawed man. And therefore, possession of truth in a theoretical sense is not sufficient. I want to just leave you with one last thing. I'm just going to quote this, and then we can go eat. When God came to create Abraham, this is a rabbinic midrash. It's from something called Genesis Rabbah, which is it means big Genesis. And what it is commentary, rabbinic commentary. And they just are very imaginative. So when God came to create Adam, the rabbis teach, the heavenly polity was split. The ministering angels formed themselves into groups and parties, some of them saying, "Let him be created," while others urged, "Let him not be created." God had nothing to say on the matter. Rather, he resolves the debate by main force. Okay, that's my little introduction. Here's what the text says. Love said, "Let him be created," because he will dispense acts of love. Truth said, "Let him not be created," because he is compounded of falsehood. Righteousness said, "Let him be created," because he will perform righteous deeds. Peace said, "Let him not be created," because he is full of strife. What did the Lord do? He took truth and cast it to the ground. Thank you.